Wyoming, 1886. The last light of summer bled across the wide valley, laying a golden sheen over the dust and sagebrush. The wind, dry and restless, carried the scent of horses and hay, whispering through the rough-hewn fences of the Bennett Ranch. On the edge of town, folks spoke of the place in hushed tones. "That's where the quiet man lives," they'd say. "The one with all the little ones." Annabeth Coil stood at the wooden gate, her gloved hands clasped before her. Her dress was simple cotton, travel-worn, the color of damp earth after a rain. She had the look of a woman who had seen sorrow and refused to be undone by it. At 28, she carried herself with a quiet grace, her hope a faint but stubborn light in her eyes. The door of the ranch house opened, and Colt Bennett filled the frame. He was tall, with shoulders broadened by years of labor, his skin weathered to bronze by sun and wind. His gaze was steady, calm, but not cold. He said nothing at first, only studied her, as if measuring the truth of her presence. Annabeth straightened her spine. "Mr. Bennett?" she began, her voice soft but clear. "I was told you have children here. I am a teacher. I came to offer lessons, reading, writing, numbers, if you would allow it." Colt leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. His tone was even, direct. "You ever had children of your own?" The question stole her breath, pressing like a stone against her ribs. After a moment, she met his gaze and answered with a truth that had cost her everything. "I cannot have children," she said quietly, "but I will love them as if they were my own." For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of the porch boards and the sigh of the wind. Then something in Colt's expression shifted. A hardness softened. A small, wry smile touched his lips, not of pity, but of plain acceptance. "Good," he said at last. "I've got enough for the both of us." He stepped aside, motioning for her to follow. They crossed the yard toward the corrals, sunlight flaring off the tin roof of the barn. "Eli!" he called out. A boy of about 10, sturdy and sharp-eyed, turned from his work. Beside him, a smaller boy, Finn, tried to mimic his brother's stance and nearly tripped over his own boots. Near a water trough, two little girls were playing. Nora, a gentle-faced child of 7, and tiny Lottie, no older than 3, clutching a wooden doll with buttons for eyes. The children stopped their games and stared at Annabeth with the open curiosity of the young. After a moment, as if satisfied, they returned to their dust-covered games and quiet laughter. Colt watched them, a pride tucked deep beneath his calm exterior. "You can teach them in the parlor," he said, his voice softer now. "The oldest is headstrong. The youngest, she walks in her sleep sometimes." Annabeth smiled faintly. "They're beautiful," she said, and she meant it. Hesitantly, she added, "They are all yours, then." Colt's gaze lingered on the children. His reply was low, almost a whisper to himself. "Enough to be." She nodded, accepting the answer for the truth it was. The tenderness in his eyes as he watched them needed no further explanation. That evening, Colt showed her to a small room off the kitchen. The walls were plain wood, the bed narrow but clean. A lamp cast a weak, flickering light on a small table. Beside it hung a half-finished knitted shawl, child-sized and soft, the needles still waiting for the next row of stitches. Annabeth set her satchel down, her fingers brushing against the yarn. She could almost feel the warmth of the small hands that had once touched it. Later, she stepped out onto the porch for a breath of cool air. The world had turned a deep lavender with the coming of dusk. Across the yard, she saw Colt carrying little Lottie in his arms. He moved with a surprising gentleness, setting the child down in a small cot near the barn window, where the air was fresh. He pulled a blanket to her chin, brushed a stray curl from her forehead, and stood there a moment longer than he needed to. Annabeth watched, the fading light catching the shine in his hair. Her voice was a whisper, meant only for the wind. "With a father like that," she said, "no child would ever have to wonder where they belong." And as night drew its calm veil over the land, something quiet and certain stirred in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt the faint pulse of home. Not because she could give life, but because here, perhaps, she could give love and be allowed to stay. The first morning at the Bennett Ranch began in silence. Annabeth rose early, the sky still a pale gray above the ridgeline. A kettle was already hissing on the stove, and beside it, someone had left a bottle of warmed milk wrapped in a cloth. There was no note, no explanation, just a quiet act of thoughtfulness. At breakfast, the children eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. They whispered amongst themselves, scattering like quail whenever she tried to speak to them directly. But their eyes followed her, wide and waiting. She did not push. She watched them play, learning the rhythm of their world. By noon, she had smoothed a patch of dirt with a stick and began drawing letters and shapes. She hummed old tunes as she showed them how a C curled like a cat's tail, how an S slithered like a snake. By the second afternoon, they were sitting nearby. By the third, they were tracing the letters with their own small fingers. Colt never commented, but each day he would pass through the parlor, giving a single, brief nod when he saw them all sitting quietly together. He was not a man of easy smiles, but she noticed a gentler set to his shoulders when he was near them. Lottie, the smallest, continued her habit of wandering at night. Twice Annabeth found her standing at the foot of the stairs, her eyes half closed, murmuring a song no one had taught her. Each time, Annabeth lifted her gently, carried her back to her cot, and settled her beneath the blankets. One night, Annabeth sat beside her and sang an old lullaby from her own childhood. Lottie's tiny hand curled around her finger, a silent promise in the dark. On the fourth morning, as sunlight spilled into the kitchen, Finn wandered in with one boot on backwards and his shirt buttoned all wrong. He gave her a lopsided grin. She helped him with the buttons, and then he proudly showed her a new word he had spelled with pebbles near the well. Tree. She clapped her hands, and he beamed. Her presence changed the rhythm of the house. She learned their silent language, how Nora twisted a braid of her hair when she was nervous, how Eli lingered at the edge of every conversation, a shadow waiting for the right moment to speak. She saw how they all looked to Colt when they were unsure, and how he answered them more often with a nod than with words. One afternoon, she was scrubbing tin plates by the water pump. The children were down by the stream, their laughter carrying on the breeze. She turned toward the porch and stopped. Colt was sitting near the door, a needle in his hand, his thick, calloused fingers clumsy as they worked to mend a tear in a small, green-checked shirt. It was Finn's. She watched as he pricked his thumb, muttered under his breath, and tried again. He looked up and caught her eye. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he glanced back down at his work. "He likes this one," he murmured. She nodded. "It suits him." He did not smile, but he kept sewing. Later that night, Long after the children were asleep, Annabeth stepped outside to clear her head. The moon hung low and soft over the hills. She heard the sound of Colt's boots on the porch behind her. "You're good with them," he said, his voice quiet. She looked out toward the dark shape of the barn. "They make it easy." He folded his arms across his chest. "Not always." Annabeth glanced back toward the silent house where 4 small lives slept safely. "No," she whispered, "not always, but always worth it." He nodded once. That was all. Inside, the fire crackled low in the hearth. The unfinished shawl by her bed was still waiting, but the house no longer felt like a stranger's. It felt lived in. And slowly, it was beginning to feel like hers. The late summer air was thick with heat and the smell of the stables. The children's laughter drifted from the west fence, a sound mixed with the clatter of boots and the rustle of dry grass. Annabeth was sorting books by the parlor window when a sharp cry sliced through the afternoon quiet. "Colt!" She rushed outside. Nora lay at the foot of the paddock fence, clutching her arm, her face pale with pain. Colt was already there, his voice tight with a frantic edge she had never heard before. "I told her not to climb. God, Nora, don't move." Annabeth dropped to her knees beside them. "Let me see." The girl's arm was bent at an unnatural angle. Nora was trembling, biting her lip so hard she drew blood. Colt's hands hovered, useless. For the first time, Annabeth saw the unflappable Colt Bennett come undone. She was just, "I didn't see." "Help me," Annabeth said, her voice calm and firm. "Find 2 straight pieces of wood, quickly." He scrambled to his feet, ripping a slat from the fence and breaking it in 2. His movements were ragged, his breathing sharp. Annabeth tore her apron into strips, gently placing the makeshift splint along the break. "It's going to hurt, sweetheart," she whispered to Nora. "But you're so brave. I know you are." The little girl nodded through her tears. Annabeth tied the splint, her movements sure and even. She wiped Nora's forehead with her sleeve and then looked up at Colt. He had fallen silent, kneeling across from her, his eyes fixed on Nora. But his gaze was filled with something else now, a mixture of grief, guilt, and awe. "I've never seen someone who's not a mother," he said, his voice low and raw, "be so much like one." She held his gaze for a second, then turned back to the whimpering child. "The worst is over," she murmured, kissing Nora's brow. "Let's get you inside." Colt lifted her into his arms as if she were made of glass. Annabeth followed, gathering what was left of her composure. They laid Nora in the spare bed. Annabeth cooled her forehead with a damp cloth and stroked her hair until sleep finally took her. Colt stood in the doorway the entire time, a silent, watchful guardian. Later that night, Annabeth sat alone in her room. From a small box wrapped in linen, she took out a child's silk ribbon, its edges frayed. Stitched into it was a single name: Clara. She touched it with gentle fingers, but for the first time in years, the tears did not come. Only a small, aching smile. The weeks passed in a quiet rhythm of chalk-dusted lessons, berry-stained fingers, and the steady sound of Colt's boots on the porch. The children had folded Annabeth into their lives as if she had always been a part of them. She mended their clothes, patched their scraped knees, and braided Nora's hair while the girl read aloud. Colt deferred to her in the running of the house, and when a larger decision arose, whether to sell a sorrel mare or keep it another month, he looked to her first. The words between them were still few, but a comfortable silence had grown, filled with unspoken understanding. Then one morning, the rhythm was broken by the sound of an unfamiliar horse. A man in a dark coat rode into the yard. He dismounted with practiced authority and produced a folded set of papers from his saddlebag. "Mr. Bennett?" he asked, his voice clipped and formal. "I'm here on behalf of the Territory Welfare Office." Colt stepped forward. "You're a long way from the courthouse." "There's been a complaint," the man replied, ignoring the remark. "You have 4 minors residing on this property. According to county records, none of them bear your name." Annabeth came to the porch, her heart beginning to pound. The man continued. "You are not their legal guardian, Mr. Bennett. There is concern that this property does not meet the qualifications for lawful care. In 10 days, we are required to relocate the children to the Cheyenne orphanage." Colt's jaw clenched, but he said nothing, only folded the notice slowly in his hands. "There must be a mistake," Annabeth's voice broke the silence. "These children are—" The man shook his head. "Ma'am, I don't make the rules. I just enforce them." When he rode away, the dust trailing behind his horse like smoke, the ranch felt hollow and dangerously quiet. That night, Annabeth found Colt sitting alone on the porch steps, staring out at the stars. She sat down beside him. The silence stretched between them, heavy and cold. Then he spoke. "They're not my blood. Eli. I found him wandering after a barn fire took his family. Nora was left on a church doorstep. Finn's mother. She died in the epidemic last spring. Lottie's father was hanged for horse theft. She was just a baby." He paused, his voice roughened by an emotion deeper than dust. "I can't make a family the way other folks do. But I saw 4 kids with nowhere else to go, and I figured I could be a place to land." Annabeth reached over and laid her hand on his. "You are," she said softly. "You are more of a home than most men ever try to be." He turned to her then, his eyes unreadable in the dark. "They'll take them, won't they?" "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Not if I have anything to say about it." A new kind of tension crept into the house. The children watched the adults with wide, worried eyes. One evening, Finn looked up from a drawing and asked, "Are we going to be sent away?" Annabeth knelt beside him. "No one is sending you anywhere, sweetheart." "But that man said we don't belong here." She took a steadying breath. "Sometimes," she said, "the people with the loudest voices and the official papers don't know the first thing about family. And sometimes we just have to remind them." In the nights that followed, as fear curled its cold fingers around her heart, Annabeth began to write. She wrote to neighbors, to the town preacher, to anyone who might speak to the character of the man who had taken in 4 lost children and the woman who had come to teach them. Quietly, word began to spread. And in the house a new bond was forged. It was not just love, but the fierce, protective thing that grows when everything is at risk, and you still choose to stay. Annabeth had come to teach children their letters, but now she was fighting to keep the one thing she never thought she'd find again: a place to belong. The storm rolled in like a living thing, low thunder crawling across the valley floor. The wind tore at the eaves of the house. Annabeth had lit every lantern, their trembling flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In the parlor, Lottie lay curled against her chest, skin burning with fever, her breath coming in shallow rasps. She whimpered in her sleep, one small hand clutching the collar of Annabeth's dress. Colt stood in the doorway, silent as always, but his stillness was different now. It was rigid, braced for impact. His eyes never left the little girl's face. "Her fever is rising," Annabeth said, her voice tight with worry. He nodded once. "I can ride for the doctor." "Colt, the river is already over its banks. A freight wagon was swept away last week. You'll never make it." "I know," he said. His voice was calm, but beneath it lay a core of iron. "But the doctor keeps a spare kit at the old mill. If I don't bring back help tonight—" "You'll drown," she interrupted, her arms tightening around Lottie. "Or you'll get there, and the storm will cut you off from coming back." Colt moved closer. He knelt by the hearth, resting one calloused hand on Lottie's small back, the other on Annabeth's shoulder. "You can take care of all four of them better than I ever could," he said quietly. "But this is the part that is mine to do." Her hand found his, squeezing it hard. The wind howled against the window panes. Then he was gone, pulling on his coat, disappearing into the driving rain, with only the dim glow of a single lantern to guide him. Inside, time slowed to a terrible crawl. Annabeth sponged Lottie's skin with cool water, whispering songs into the crook of her neck. The other children hovered nearby, Eli pacing the floorboards, Finn sitting motionless on the stairs, Nora biting her thumbnail until it bled. At one point, Finn asked, his voice barely audible over the storm, "Is Pa coming back?" Annabeth's heart twisted. She gathered him into her free arm. "If it's for one of you," she whispered, "he would ride through anything." The minutes stretched into an hour, then two. Thunder growled low in the belly of the sky. Then, through the roar of the storm, another sound. Hoofbeats, faint at first, then closer. Not one horse, but two. Annabeth rushed to the door and threw it open. There he was, Colt, drenched and pale, mud to his knees, water streaming from his hat. He was leading a second horse, and on it, the town doctor clung to his saddle, a leather satchel clutched in his hand. Colt nearly collapsed in the doorway. "I got him," he managed, his breath ragged. By morning, Lottie's fever had broken. She lay wrapped in blankets, her breathing deep and even. The house was filled with the kind of profound stillness that follows a crisis, the exhausted hush of relief. In a corner chair, Colt sat slumped, fast asleep, his boots still wet. Annabeth stood in the doorway and watched him, her heart full. A knock came just after sunrise. Two men from the county stood on the porch, their hats in their hands. "We've received a great deal of testimony on your behalf," one of them said, holding out a sealed envelope. "And this letter," he glanced at Annabeth, "from a Ms. Coil. It seems that made all the difference." He passed her the official document. "The removal order has been rescinded. The children can stay." Behind her, bare feet padded across the wooden floor. Finn had heard. "Are we staying?" he asked, his voice small and hopeful. Annabeth looked from the boy to the sleeping man in the chair, to the child breathing safely in her bed. She knelt down and pulled Finn into a hug, her own quiet answer filling the spaces where words were no longer needed. "Yes," she thought, "we are staying." Annabeth crouched to his level, her smile wavering as tears welled in her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "You're home." And somewhere behind them, as Colt stirred awake, He let himself believe it too. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered, in the groan of the porch floorboards, in the way the wind now felt gentler, as if it had spent all its fury and had only kindness left. A week later, a letter arrived. It came in an official envelope, bearing the county stamp, the kind of mail that had once meant only fear. This time, Colt opened it with steady fingers, but as his eyes scanned the page, his hands began to tremble. "They approved it," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "It's done." Annabeth moved to his side. "What does it say?" He handed her the paper, but she only needed to glance at the first line before her own eyes filled. "Legal guardianship confirmed," she read softly. "Colt Bennett, sole provider. Annabeth Coil, co-caretaker." The children were already gathering, drawn by the shift in the air. Annabeth knelt, pulling them into a tight circle. "You're staying," she told them, her voice thick with emotion. "No more questions. No more goodbyes. We're a family now." They didn't understand the legal words, but they understood the tears of relief on her face and the quiet strength of Colt's hand resting on Eli's shoulder. That night, for the first time, their tears were not of fear, but of the overwhelming peace that comes from finally being wanted. In the kitchen, where a batch of cornbread was slightly burned at the edges, and the lamplight cast a warm glow on the old stone walls, something settled. It wasn't just peace. It was the feeling of belonging. The days that followed were quieter, lighter. Colt and Annabeth moved through the small house like two people who had been holding their breath for years and were finally allowed to exhale. He started asking her things, small things at first. "Should we move the crib in here? Ought we teach Finn his letters or numbers?" She answered with a soft smile, a nod, or a gentle touch on his arm. One evening, she asked him to eat at the table inside. He usually took his meals on the porch, a man half in and half out of his own life. But that night, he stayed. As they ate stew and flatbread, she told a story that made Nora laugh so hard she snorted. Colt looked up, startled by the sound, and then a slow, genuine chuckle rumbled in his own chest. Later, as he stood to leave, she reached up to straighten his collar. Her fingers brushed the stubble on his jaw, and the world seemed to stop. They froze, caught in the space between a simple gesture and something much, much more. One morning, she didn't come downstairs. Colt stood in the quiet kitchen, staring at the cold stove. He found her still in bed, her cheeks flushed not with fever, but with profound exhaustion. So, he tried. He burned the toast and overcooked the eggs. The coffee was black as tar and twice as bitter. But he set it all on a tray, and beside it, a folded note in his simple, square handwriting. "Let me do for you today." When she found it, she simply pressed the note to her heart and closed her eyes. That night, as she rocked Lottie by the fire, Colt stood watching the flames dance. "I'm not much for big words," he said, his voice low. "But I was thinking, if you were to stay on, I think this place could become something good. For all of us. For me too." She didn't answer with words. As she rose and passed him, her hand found his, her touch warm and gentle. It lingered a moment too long to be an accident. He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her. In the firelight, their eyes met, and nothing needed to be said. Some love doesn't arrive in a thunderclap. It grows in the quiet moments, in shared meals and burned toast, in the silent, steady act of not letting go. Winter came early that year, sharp and unforgiving. The frost glazed the porch before the pumpkins were gone, and soon the ground was as hard as iron. Snow fell in a thick, ceaseless curtain, burying the fields and silencing the woods. One morning Colt stood in the doorway, a scarf tied tight around his neck. Eli, looking too small in his bulky coat, held the reins of a horse with a 10-year-old's fierce determination. "Be back in 2 days," Colt said, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "Town's low on supplies, but we'll manage." Annabeth simply handed him a bundle of bread and jerky, her eyes searching his. "Be careful." His gaze softened. "Always." They rode off, two dark silhouettes slowly swallowed by the endless white. The snow never stopped. By the third day, the wind howled like a hungry wolf, and Annabeth's knuckles bled from splitting firewood. The animals grew restless in the barn. When the children fell asleep, huddled under every quilt they owned, she sat by the dying fire and whispered prayers she hadn't spoken since she'd lost her own son. Just before dawn on the fourth morning, she heard it. Hoofbeats, muffled and desperate. She flung the door open. Colt stumbled inside, half carrying a near-frozen Eli. Both were soaked, their lips tinged with blue, but they were alive. "Inside," she commanded, her voice low and urgent. "Coats off. Hot water, now." She worked with a fierce tenderness, wrapping them in wool, forcing warm broth between their lips, rubbing life back into their frozen fingers. Eli's eyes fluttered open and met hers. "Sorry," he rasped. She just kissed his forehead. Later, when the fire blazed and the house was finally warm, she went to the kitchen for more wood. Colt was there, standing in the shadows with steam rising from his shoulders. His eyes found hers across the dim room, and in that instant, the dam of her control finally broke. "You scared me," she said, her voice trembling. He took a step toward her, slow and careful. "I'm sorry." A sob caught in her throat. I thought I'd lost you." "I know." He reached out, his hand settling gently on her shoulder. "I've never had a place to come back to," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not a real one. Not until you." She turned to face him, her eyes wet but clear. "And I never thought I could be chosen again," she whispered. "Not after everything." He stepped closer, closing the small space between them. There was no ring. There were no flowers. There was only a man who had given his life to children who were not his own, standing before the woman who made that life feel like a blessing. "You said you can't have children," he said softly. "But you've been a mother in every way that matters. I don't want you to teach them anymore." Her breath hitched. "No? I want you to raise them, with me, as their mother, and as my wife." Silence. And then tears. Soft, healing tears. Annabeth gave a single, trembling nod, and he pulled her into his arms. There were no fireworks, only the hush of falling snow and the steady, quiet rhythm of two hearts finally finding their way home. Spring arrived like a quiet apology. After a long, hard winter, the land softened. Buds swelled on the skeletal branches of the trees, and wildflowers bloomed along the fence line. The Bennett Ranch, once a place of whispered rumors, now buzzed with a gentle, hopeful life. Under the great oak tree, simple white chairs were set in rows. On a small table sat 2 tin cups filled with lilacs, and a pair of copper wedding bands, hammered into shape by the town blacksmith. Annabeth appeared at the edge of the clearing, her dress a simple, cream-colored cotton that brushed against the new grass. Nora tucked a wildflower into her sash, as Eli and Finn, their faces solemn, each took one of her hands. Together, they walked her down the makeshift aisle. Colt stood waiting, his hair combed and his boots shined, but it was the light in his eyes that outshone everything. When the time came, he took her hands in his. "I can't promise you riches," he said, his voice low and certain. "But I promise you this. Every morning you wake here, you'll know you are needed. You'll know you are wanted. You'll know you are loved." Annabeth's lips trembled, but her smile held steady, and that was answer enough. In the weeks that followed, the ranch transformed. Annabeth began teaching the local children under the oak tree, her chalkboard propped against a barrel. Colt repaired saddles for neighbors and traded horses for seed. The children, no longer just a collection of orphans but sons and daughters, grew in the shelter of a love that didn't need to be loud to be true. One golden afternoon, Annabeth sat on the porch, watching as Eli helped Colt mend a bridle, their heads bent together in easy companionship. She looked at the life they had built from ashes and ruins, and whispered to herself, "I used to think my life was over. It turns out, it was just waiting to begin." Colt glanced up, as if sensing her thoughts. "You're not just their mother, Annabeth," he said quietly. "You're the mother of this whole home." She blinked back a sudden rush of tears and said nothing. Some feelings were too deep for words. Love didn't need to be declared anymore. It just needed to be lived. "Thank you for riding with us on the heartfelt journey of—" She said, "I can't have children." The cowboy smiled. "Good. I've got enough kids for both of us." If you believe that family is built not by blood, but by the courage to show up and the strength to stay, then hit that hype button, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that home is a feeling, not a place. We have more powerful stories of grit, healing, and second chances coming your way. Until then, ride gently, love deeply, and remember, the wildest frontiers are often the ones within the human heart.